Hello everyone, this is your boy Newbie Coder with yet another Python video. This one's going to be on functions. If you're interested, go check out my other videos of Python that I released prior to this in this series. Just come back when you're ready for functions. Alright, let's jump right into functions. So I want to first start off by defining what a function really is. So in simple terms, function is a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. So basically, you give your function an input and it acts like a black box, which you can define in different ways, and then it will produce an output for you. So that's kind of the simple terminology that I want you to kind of understand, and then the rest of these we're going to go over in the code itself, so you have a better idea of what function is and what it's used for. So it keeps your code organized, and you don't have to repeat certain code because functions allow you to reuse blocks of code. All right, let's jump right into the terminal. I'm in my folder functions which I created, and I'm gonna go ahead and open up VS Code. Now let's create a file called newbiefunctions.py. All right, now let's talk about functions, and I'm gonna walk you through an example and you'll understand more about functions and why they're really useful. So imagine your manager asks you to calculate the square of a value. So let's say the value is 13. You don't know how to do that off the top of your head, so you go ahead and use Python. Now, the way you would do that normally is you would declare or initialize a variable called x, and you would give it the value that your manager asked for, and then you would create another variable that is a result of the value times the value itself, right? So that would give you the square, and then you would print the result, and that would give you the answer, 169. So you go back, and then he asks you to calculate the square of 15. So you do that, you go back, and then he asks you to calculate the cube. So you copy and paste this code, and you multiply x again, and now you have the square and the cubed. Then you have, let's say, some random block of code right here, and then deep down you are asked to determine the cube again, and then you have a bunch of other lines of code, and then you have to calculate the square again somewhere down here in your code, because you're going to use that operation in multiple areas in your code, and you know, this could span to hundreds or thousands of rows of code. All right, now you start to notice this method that I'm doing here, which is very basic. It's plain Python. It's almost like a calculator, right? But notice the repetition. We've got this piece of code, we've got this piece of code repeated again, and then we have this repeated here. And then obviously you could have, you know, another repetition here as well, and so on. So that tends to, you know, really make the code unreadable, in a sense that, you know, you're repeating the same thing again, and if there's an issue, you won't know where it's at, and it's not clear and concise, right? And it's not organized. So that's where functions are really useful, because we can use it as a repeatable block of code. So let's go ahead and do this the right way with functions. So the first thing you need to do is you need to define the function. Okay, so the way you define a function is you start off with def, and then the function name, and then open and close brackets, and inside the brackets you basically have the parameters of the function. So the parameter is what the function can accept, and then you end with a colon, and then right below you basically have the body of the function. Okay, so that's just in comments, but let me go ahead and create the function right here. So obviously we want to calculate the square of the value because that's what our manager asked. So we're gonna go ahead and define a function called squared value, just like we mentioned here. And then right below is the body of the function, which is where we put in what the function will do. And in this case, we just copy and paste this here because that's exactly what we want our function to do. All right, so now we have this function defined. One thing to notice is right now my parameter is empty, so we need to define that. So we give it a parameter x, but it doesn't necessarily have to be x because this x here is not related to this x here. This could be a number, and let's make it a number so it's more understandable. So this, let's say, is number times number. And what that means is this function can take in any number and multiply it together, give you a result, right? So again, that's what a function does, is input, operation, and output. That's all this is right here. This is the output, this is the input, and this is the operation. Cool. So obviously there's no such thing as num here, right? Right now we have x is 15, but how do we tell this function to calculate the square of 15? The way to do that is you need to call a function. So the way you call a function is pretty straightforward. It's almost exactly like how you define a function, except you don't use definition because at that point you're not defining it, but you're calling it. So the way you call it is you use a function name and then the brackets, and then here instead of num was a parameter of the function, you would provide it an argument. Okay, so in this case you'd say function name and argument. So the argument is what you give to the function. Remember, the parameter is what the function accepts, and the argument is what you provide to the function. So we're providing the value 15, right? Or the variable x. So we're gonna go ahead and do that here, and we're gonna comment all of this so that our output is clear. Okay, and now I'm gonna go ahead and run this, and as you can see, it prints out 225. Everything else is commented. It basically took this value of 15, it plugged the value 15 here, and it called this function, so the value of 15 went here, and then it was multiplied together to give the result. Now, one thing I want you to know is if, for instance, I had this function definition right after I called it, that's not going to work. As you see, the error, squared value is not defined. So you always need to define the function before you can use it. And just think of it like general knowledge, that if you don't define something, how do you expect it to do what you want, right? You need to define it first. Always have your function definitions before you call them. That's great. Now we also want to calculate the cube of our value, right? Just to please our manager. So we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to define the function first. So let's say def, and then we're going to call it cubed value, and we're going to use the same parameter. We could call it different parameter. We could, let's for the sake of, you know, your understanding, we could call this y. Doesn't matter. And we will multiply y with y, and then print the result. Okay, now there's no such thing as y in the rest of this code. That means we need to provide this function the value of y. So in order to do that, we need to call this function. So right after we calculate the square, we want to calculate the cube, and we want to provide it the value x. So x is 15. That value comes here and here. And then right here it doesn't matter what you name this parameter. Like I said, you could call it num, you could call it y, you could call it z. As long as you use the same variable inside the body, you're good to go. This variable is not related to this. So remember, arguments are different than the parameters. They don't have to be the same. They could be, but they don't have to be. So x is equals to 15 is going to be the input to both of these functions, and then these two, the function definitions, are going to go ahead and output the oops, my bad. So this will have to be the cubed, right? Because we're calculating the cube. This one's the squared. And I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you see it gives us two values, the square and the cubed. So that was pretty straightforward. You have a value, you declared two functions that are going to do different tasks, and then you call the function. Now, to show you the advantage, remember how we were repeating the blocks of code? We can do that. You know, we have some random block of code, but then all we need to do is just simply call the function in different locations. So let's say if the function needs to change later, you basically just change the code here. You don't just want to print the result, you want to also print a piece of code. So you would say print hello with the result. So you're going to go ahead and do that, and it's going to print hello with it. Instead of repeating, let's say, print hello multiple times in your code, like this, you would just do it once here inside your function. And that way your code, the rest of your code stays clean, and all you do is mess around with how you define the function. So pretty straightforward. Now, a function does not always need to return a value. That might be confusing, but I'm going to try to make it very simple. This function definition is not returning a value. In order for a function to return a value, you need to give it a return statement. So when you have a print statement and no return statement, it basically is a return equals none. So it doesn't need to return the value to the rest of the code. But let's say I want to return the result and use it elsewhere, right? Because once you calculate the squared value, you may want to use it somewhere else, like for instance, calculating the area of a circle, pi r squared. Once you calculate the r squared, you need to multiply it by the value of pi to calculate the area. So to do that, all you need to do is, let's say you don't want to print it, you just want to return the value. You would type in a return statement, notice the indentation, and then whatever you want to return. In this case, we want to return the squared value, right? So we can go ahead and do this, and then right here, this function is going to return a value. So when you call that function, it's going to return something, and you need to store that return value in a variable or use it somewhere, right? So in our case, let's store it in a variable called squared value. Let's call it return squared value, just to be different from the function name, like that. Now we can go ahead and print that variable just to double check, and it seems to be working, and it's printing the value. So I'm gonna go ahead and comment everything else just so it's cleaner to read, and there you go. So it's printing this value. Okay, what I did there was, instead of printing the result within the function definition, I asked the function to return the result back to where you called the function and then do something else with it. So now that we have the return square value, let's say we calculate area of a circle equals to 3.14 times the return square value, and then you can calculate this area of a circle. So it won't be 225 now, as you'll notice, it's the area of the circle is 706.5. So that's the beauty of returning the result, is you can use that in other formulas, and that's most likely going to be the case, but in some cases you will be printing the output instead of returning it, which is perfectly fine. Awesome. Alright, so one thing to keep in mind is that there's a cleaner way to do this, which would be you just return the operation itself. So just like that, it would give the same result, and you notice you take out a line of code, so it's much cleaner, and I'm going to go ahead and run it. It will still give you the value of the area of the circle. That's function return. Alright, so that was the basics of functions. I hope you learned something today. In the next few videos, I will go into more detail and in depth because functions are very powerful. See you in the next video. Thank you so much. Goodbye.